This image is familiar to anyone who has ever watched a report on the Asian economic miracle. A dazzling white train with a streamlined nose glides silently along a concrete viaduct against a backdrop of green mountains. It seems like the perfect embodiment of the future, a triumph of engineering and pure, uninterrupted progress.
We are shown a showcase of ideal motion, where there is no room for friction, fatigue, or delays.
But this flawless picture is merely an optical illusion, concealing the system's colossal internal strain. If you look beneath the concrete viaducts, you can see a structure operating at the limits of its physical and economic capabilities. Trillions in debt, threatening to bring down the budgets of entire provinces. Deserted cities from which the workforce was drained at breakneck speed. Thousands of kilometers of tracks laid in absolute emptiness to maintain the pace of concrete pouring. This network is not a transportation project, nor is it an attempt to make people's lives more convenient. It is a brutal physical experiment on space, a steel skeleton tightly binding a vast territory. It is an absolute instrument of state power, transformed into heavy infrastructure.
By the end of this journey, it will become crystal clear why these trains race at such a terrifying speed.
You will understand the real price paid for every second of time saved and what this road has become. But to grasp the scale of this steel trap, we must return to the past, to a time when speed was an unaffordable luxury and space seemed impenetrable and hostile. In the late 1990s, the vast expanse of this enormous country was its greatest curse and its physical constraint. The economy was beginning to accelerate. Factories along the coast demanded millions of workers, but geography desperately resisted. People moved across the country at the speed of horse-drawn transport, suffocating in cramped and filthy train cars. The railway network was an endless string of so-called green trains. These were heavy, unwieldy trains that crawled through the provinces at an average speed of 40 kilometers per hour.
In winter, the water in them froze, and in summer, the air turned into a thick mixture of sweat, coal dust, and tobacco smoke.
A trip from west to east took several days of uninterrupted physical suffering. The cars were so packed that people slept under the seats and in the vestibules, unable to move. During holidays, train stations turned into zones of humanitarian disaster, with crowds of thousands storming the doors. Labor migration looked like a slow, agonizing movement of blood clots through the state's worn-out veins. The country produced goods for the whole world, but was itself suffocating from internal logistical paralysis. Bottlenecks on the railways slowed coal delivery, bringing power plants and entire factories to a halt. The old infrastructure, built back in the middle of the century, was physically incapable of handling the new volume of cargo and people. The rails wore out faster than they could be replaced, and the ties rotted under the weight of overloaded freight trains. Economic growth threatened to drown in its own stagnation. The government realized that without a radical reduction in travel time, the country would simply break apart into isolated pieces. The wealthy South would finally break away from the impoverished West, creating the inevitable conditions for social upheaval.
A leap forward was needed, one that was physically impossible to achieve through the gradual modernization of the old railways.
But the state had neither its own high-speed rail technology nor engineers with the necessary experience. Attempts to build its own high-speed train led only to the assembly of unstable, dangerous prototypes. These machines vibrated dangerously at speed and threatened to derail at the slightest bend in the track. The time for experiments was over. The overheated economy demanded an immediate and radical solution. A cold, pragmatic decision was made to buy foreign expertise, completely disregarding national pride. The country prepared to open its doors to foreign corporations, but on its own harsh terms. In the early 2000s, representatives of the world's largest corporations entered the offices of the Ministry of Railways. Germany's Siemens, France's Alstom, Canada's Bombardier, and Japan's Kawasaki came to divide up the largest market on the planet. They brought with them blueprints for ideal machines capable of flying along the rails at a speed of 250 kilometers per hour. Western engineers looked at local officials with the undisguised superiority of absolute monopolists. They planned to sell ready-made trains, keeping the technology and profitable maintenance services in their own hands. It was a classic deal where technology is exchanged for unlimited access to resources and cheap assembly. But the architects of the new infrastructure issued an unprecedented ultimatum that shocked the foreigners.
They refused to buy ready-made trains, demanding the full transfer of blueprints, algorithms, and assembly technologies.
A mandatory condition was the creation of joint ventures where foreigners were required to train local engineers. The corporations resisted, fully aware that they were creating a global and ruthless competitor with their own hands. Negotiations dragged on for days, accompanied by outright blackmail, bluffing, and threats to award multi-billion-dollar contracts to rivals. They resorted to directly pitting European and Japanese tech companies against one another. Greed triumphed over strategic calculation, and the Western giants surrendered one after another under the weight of the sums offered. They signed the contracts, naively consoling themselves with the notion that local industry would be unable to master the most complex alloys. They believed that control over microprocessors and software would remain forever in Europe and Japan. The first gleaming trains, resembling spaceships from another dimension, began arriving in the country.
They were unloaded at ports and transported with the utmost care to new, sterile assembly halls.
For local industry, this was contact with an alien intelligence, a profound technological shock. But behind the closed doors of the guarded factories, a process of ruthless dissection of alien technologies began. Every component, every sensor, and every detail of the fuselage was subjected to detailed study and replication. The aliens' decades of experience were absorbed with the greed of a starving person who had suddenly gained access to food. Engineers dismantled German and Japanese locomotives down to the last screw, turning factories into dissection theaters. They studied the aerodynamics of nose cones, the composition of multi-layer composite materials, and the architecture of braking systems. This was not merely industrial espionage. It was a total deconstruction of a foreign mechanical body. The goal was not to blindly copy, but to deeply understand the physics of the process. Enormous computing power was devoted to simulating airflow and calculating metal fatigue under extreme loads. Thousands of young technicians spent days on end studying translated specifications, trying to unravel the logic of Western designers. Foreign consultants watched in horror as their strict regulations were violated for the sake of large-scale experiments. Local specialists began making unauthorized changes to the design, trying to squeeze the absolute maximum out of the vehicles. They combined Japanese chassis with German power electronics, creating mechanical hybrids. Safety systems, designed for conservative European train intervals, were ruthlessly reprogrammed by software engineers.
The authorities needed a traffic density that was unattainable and unthinkable in any Western country.
The program code was hacked at the kernel level to force the trains to run in a tight formation, one after another. Western companies began to protest officially, absolving themselves of responsibility for the safety of the modified trains. They warned that the metal would not withstand unplanned overloads and that the brake pads would burn out under such a schedule. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of workshops under construction and political slogans about technological independence. A few years later, trains rolled out of the factory gates, now devoid of any foreign logos. Outwardly, they still resembled their European and Japanese forebears, but their innards had been completely overhauled. These were heavy machines, adapted to the harsh realities of a vast and impatient nation.
The technological umbilical cord had been severed, and the country announced the creation of its own high-speed standard.
Western partners suddenly found themselves superfluous and useless at this celebration of engineering triumph. Now the system had its own powerful body, but to set it in motion, the surrounding world had to be completely rebuilt. The high speed of modern express trains tolerates absolutely no compromises with the natural terrain. A train flying along the tracks at over 300 kilometers per hour is physically incapable of winding around hills or descending smoothly into ravines. The turning radius for such a train must be many kilometers, and any elevation changes must be reduced to an absolute mathematical zero. Even the slightest deviation in the track at such speeds turns a comfortable ride into a dangerous roller coaster ride with an unpredictable outcome. Engineers were faced with the challenge of creating a perfectly straight line on the rugged surface of the planet. To ensure such flawless geometry, the designers had to literally detach the railroad from the uneven and capricious ground. It was decided that nearly 90% of all new tracks would be laid on gigantic, perfectly level concrete viaducts. Thus began the most massive and aggressive terraforming in human history since the retreat of the last glaciers. Vast expanses turned into a construction site where nature was systematically replaced by artificial gray stone. This project required resources comparable to the costs of a world war. The global financial crisis of 2008 became a powerful and unexpected catalyst for this colossal process. To save the national economy from total collapse, the government poured trillions of state yuan into transportation infrastructure. The construction of high-speed railways instantly turned into a non-stop, gigantic conveyor belt of money burning and continuous cement pouring. Economic growth now depended directly on the number of support pillars erected and kilometers of steel track laid. The country was literally pouring its gold and foreign exchange reserves into concrete, hoping to outpace the global crisis. Hundreds of thousands of workers from all corners of the country were thrown into the construction of endless rows of concrete piers stretching far beyond the horizon. Special monster machines, weighing thousands of tons, slowly and majestically crawled along these piers, independently laying the finished multi-ton spans. The landscape of entire eastern provinces changed beyond recognition in the mere months of this frenzied and uninterrupted work. Where rice fields had flourished for centuries, a gray concrete jungle now towered, slicing through the landscape in a straight line. Ancient mountains were mercilessly pierced through with tunnels of perfect cross-section, with no regard whatsoever for the colossal costs of explosives and equipment. Villages and small towns that happened to lie along the route's straight line were ruthlessly demolished by heavy bulldozers, along with their centuries-old history. Millions of tons of steel were used for rebar, forcing steel mills to operate at the very limit of their design capacity. Nothing could stand in the way of this gray concrete wave, devouring everything in its path. Concrete flowed like an endless river, filling ancient swamps, crossing wide rivers and forever covering fertile farmland with a cold, gray shadow. This infrastructure possessed such colossal physical weight that it literally pressed down on the region's tectonic plates. The Earth itself seemed to groan under the unbearable weight of human ambition, encased in a cyclopean, reinforced concrete framework. The landscape became monotonous, industrial, and lifeless, transforming into a monument to engineering obsession. It seemed that this gigantic and complex construction mechanism could no longer be stopped by any reasonable means. The leadership developed a persistent and dangerous illusion of absolute control over the harsh natural world and the inexorable passage of time itself. But as the length of the tracks grew, a hidden, deadly tension began to rise rapidly within this gigantic system. The higher the overpasses rose, the more terrifying the price of even the slightest mistake could become. The authorities demanded not merely comfortable and fast travel from the railroad workers. They persistently craved an absolute world record. The reading on the digital speedometer in the engineer's cab quickly became the Ministry of Railways' primary political fetish. High speed became a tangible symbol of national greatness, an indisputable proof of the new system's superiority over the old world. Every extra kilometer per hour was perceived as a triumph of ideology over the laws of matter. The standard 300 kilometers per hour already seemed insufficiently impressive to the top leadership to demonstrate the true might of the state. Soon a direct order came to accelerate commercial trains first to 350 and then to 380 kilometers per hour. Leading engineers timidly tried to object, pointing to the immutable laws of physics and the strength limits of the materials used. However, in the atmosphere of record chasing, technical arguments were considered a sign of weakness or even covert sabotage. At such extreme speeds, the air becomes dense and viscous, like water, fiercely resisting the movement of the flying steel bullet. The powerful vibration of the wheel sets is transmitted to the entire car body, threatening to rupture the welds and internal panel fasteners at any moment. The wheel bearings overheat to critical temperatures, risking becoming permanently seized at full speed due to metal expansion. The train's mechanics operated under conditions for which they were never designed by their original creators. The sudden change in pressure as the train entered a tunnel pounded passengers' ears, testing the strength of the laminated glass and the airtightness of the passenger compartment. Every extra kilometer per hour increased wear on the track and all associated infrastructure at an alarming geometric rate. The copper contact wire above the tracks was rapidly being ground into fine dust by the frenzied friction of the current collectors racing at tremendous speeds. Operating costs were rising, but no one paid attention to them in the frenzy of the speed race. But ironclad political will rigidly and systematically ignored metal fatigue and the basic laws of aerodynamics. Train drivers were ordered to maintain the maximum possible speed on the stretches, despite the persistent warning signals from the onboard sensors. Trains ran on the tracks daily, operating at the very limits of their original design capabilities, established back during the planning phase. Safety was sacrificed for the sake of impressive figures in official reports and newspaper headlines. It was a daily and deadly game of Russian roulette at the speed of a small light aircraft. From the outside, the trains looked flawless and futuristic, gliding smoothly along the rails with a light whistle as they sliced through the dense air. But deep within the complex mechanisms, invisible micro-cracks were already accumulating, and the electronics were beginning to experience dangerous periodic malfunctions caused by vibrations. The system was running itself into the ground, wearing out its lifespan dozens of times faster than specified in the manual. The entire railway network was stretched tight as a guitar string, ready to snap with a crack at the slightest accidental touch. The illusion of absolute safety rested solely on incredible luck and the enormous margin of safety built in by Western designers. A technological catastrophe at such speeds was not an accident, but merely an inevitable matter of time and place. The thunder was bound to strike, and everyone involved in the actual operation of these steel projectiles understood this. This steel frenzy had a specific name and face: Railway Minister Liu Zhijun. He was a man of maniacal, destructive energy, an architect of speed who ruled his department like an independent feudal prince. He turned the ministry into an isolated state within a state, with its own police, courts, and a trillion-yuan budget. Liu had an innate intolerance for dissent and demanded that impossible schedules be met at absolutely any cost. He personally rode in the drivers' cabs during test runs, ordering safety systems to be disabled for the sake of records. His subordinates literally lived and slept in their offices, burning out quickly from constant stress and fear of dismissal. But behind the glittering facade of these grand construction projects lay the deep rot of unprecedented systemic corruption. Contracts for concrete pouring and electronic supply were distributed exclusively among a narrow circle of affiliated companies. Huge kickbacks were built right into the official construction estimates for bridges and tunnels from the very start. To make up for the stolen billions, general contractors began cutting corners on the invisible layer of infrastructure. They skimped on steel reinforcement and concrete supports, replacing high-quality metal with brittle, cheap scrap. Sand for construction mixes was taken from polluted rivers, triggering a slow process of chemical deterioration in the structures. Complex signaling systems were hastily installed, blatantly ignoring electrical contact insulation protocols. Fake quality certificates allowed inspectors to turn a blind eye to defective parts in the train's undercarriage. The massive, sun-glinting body of the high-speed network was fatally infected by parasites from within. The infrastructure, designed to withstand colossal physical loads, stood on a fragile foundation of lies and stolen materials. Liu Zhijun knew this perfectly well, but he was concerned only with the political pace of commissioning new lines. He sincerely believed that the historic scale of the project would forever absolve any sins and technical flaws. The ministry blindly drove the trains forward, turning a blind eye to the flashing red lights on the dispatchers' consoles. The railway had become too large to be safely managed manually, but the automation remained crude and unstable. A critical mass of unnoticed errors had finally accumulated. The summer of 2011 marked the moment when physics dealt a brutal blow to politics. The July night thunderstorm over the city of Wenzhou was nothing out of the ordinary for the humid southern climate. But for the overloaded, compromise-ridden electronic network, it became a fatal trigger. A powerful lightning strike hit equipment on the line, instantly knocking out the traffic control system. The alarm system, which was supposed to stop trains in the event of a loss of communication, issued a false green light. Dispatchers in the control center were completely blinded, losing track of the trains on their monitors. The high-speed train traveling along the elevated viaduct came to a smooth stop in the darkness, completely out of power. A few kilometers behind it, another heavy train was speeding along, trying to make up for lost time. Its automatic controls remained silent, absolutely certain that the track ahead was completely clear. The engineer of the second train saw the red tail lights of the stationary cars too late to maneuver. Emergency braking on the wet, slippery rails was accompanied only by the piercing screech of metal burning from friction. A 1,000-ton kinetic projectile slammed into the stationary cars at tremendous speed, crushing them like plastic cups. The monstrous force of the impact tore apart the steel couplings and hurled the mangled cars into the night air. 4 cars broke loose from the 20-meter-high concrete overpass and crashed with a thunderous roar into the sticky swamp below. The metal plating burst open with a deafening crack, exposing the fragile and defenseless human bodies inside. This was not merely a tragic train crash, it was the collapse of the national myth of the system's infallibility. Photographs of the mangled white cars hanging vertically from the bridge instantly spread across the global network. The blood on the white plastic of the destroyed interiors forever shattered the sterile image of a technological marvel. The system's own reaction to the disaster proved more terrifying and cynical than the physical impact itself. Instead of a thorough investigation, the authorities rushed in with excavators and began burying the wrecked cars right in the mud. They desperately tried to hide the evidence of their haste, but only provoked a wave of uncontrollable public fury. The tragedy in Wenzhou served as a cold shower that instantly halted the mad race for speed. The government realized with horror that the limit of physical endurance had been reached, and the next step led into the abyss. An extremely painful period of public sobering up and large-scale dismantling of the Ministry of Railways legacy began. The all-powerful minister Liu Zhijun was arrested, and his massive department was disbanded and split into smaller units. Across the country, unprecedented track inspections and ultrasonic audits of the concrete-filled viaducts began. Auditors found alarming voids in bridge supports and deep cracks in brand-new tunnels. The decision most painful to political pride was made: to officially and universally reduce speed. Trains were strictly prohibited from exceeding 300 kilometers per hour on the vast majority of operating lines. The schedule was completely rewritten to give the exhausted machinery time to cool down and undergo nightly maintenance. The loss of the world speed record saved the gigantic system from inevitable catastrophic failure. Engineers finally had time to replace defective parts and calmly debug the emergency braking algorithms. The clamor of triumphant propaganda gave way to the quiet, methodical rustle of technical regulations and new safety protocols. The emergency trains were secretly dug out of the mud and sent to closed laboratories for the study of deformations. The illusion of an easy and quick triumph was finally dispelled, giving way to heavy, exhausting work. The body of the railroad survived a massive heart attack, but lost its youthful carefreeness forever. But the emergency rescue from technical collapse suddenly exposed another, even more terrifying systemic problem. During the period of unbridled construction, the corporation had managed to accumulate monstrous, irreversible financial obligations. Speed on the tracks had fallen, but the rate of interest accumulation on debts had only increased many times over. The infrastructure required daily injections of billions simply to maintain itself in a safe, operational condition. From the engine of the economy, it began to rapidly transform into a black hole devouring the region's resources. The logic of large-scale infrastructure is ruthless. To justify the investment in any way, the network must constantly grow. After saturating the densely populated eastern coast, the concrete tentacles inevitably reached out toward the empty west. Construction took on a completely irrational character, finally breaking away from any economic feasibility. Shimmering rails were laid across the arid deserts of Xinjiang and the unstable permafrost of the Tibetan Plateau. The cost of a single kilometer of track in the Rocky Mountains exceeded all reasonable and conceivable budgetary limits. Trains raced along viaducts as tall as skyscrapers, carrying only a handful of random passengers inside. So-called ghost stations appeared, giant marble palaces rising in the middle of empty cornfields. Local authorities built them in the desperate hope that the railroad itself would bring life and investment. But the physical effect turned out to be exactly the opposite. High-speed rail lines began to function like powerful pumps. Instead of developing small towns, the trains rapidly sucked young professionals and small businesses out of them. People preferred to board a comfortable train car and commute to work in the metropolis, leaving the provinces to slowly die out. Magnificent glass train stations stood completely empty, echoing with the footsteps of the few bored security guards. The State Railway Corporation had accumulated a total debt significantly exceeding the GDP of many developed countries. Servicing these colossal loans ate up all the operating profits from ticket sales on busy lines. Regional governments teetered on the brink of default, struggling with their last ounce of strength to pay subsidies for empty trains. The financial pressure on the system reached critical levels, threatening an invisible but devastating economic explosion. Tickets for high-speed trains remained too expensive for rural residents, cutting them off from this marvel of transportation. The railroad became an exclusive tool for the elite, physically cementing the stratification of a vast society. The urgent rescue from a technical catastrophe led the system into a protracted, exhausting financial one. The scale of the concrete project proved too heavy a burden even for the world's second-largest economy, but it was physically impossible to stop the trains. Otherwise, the very pulse of the state would have ceased. Today, this colossal network has long ceased to be evaluated by classic criteria of profitability or commercial return on investment. It has transformed into something far greater than simply a comfortable way to travel from one point to another. The railway web has become a rigid steel leash by which the center keeps its restless peripheries firmly in check. No region can any longer physically isolate itself, shut itself off, or block its administrative borders. If necessary, deploying tens of thousands of soldiers or police officers to the other end of the country will take a matter of hours. The infrastructure has completely erased those protective distances, forever depriving the provinces of any geographical autonomy. Freedom of movement has turned into a convenient illusion, subject to total, continuous digital surveillance. The purchase of every ticket is strictly linked to a personal identifier in the state social rating system. Turnstiles at the entrance scan faces, cross-referencing the retina with the security service's endless databases. A person with a low rating or simply a politically unreliable citizen will be physically unable to access the platform. The railway has become a gigantic physical filter, infallibly separating compliant elements from undesirable ones. Trains run on a perfect schedule, but every person's route inside is calculated and stored on servers. White train cars glide past thousands of surveillance cameras, transforming into closed, sterile spaces at breakneck speed. This is an absolutely perfect symbiosis of heavy industrial infrastructure and modern, invisible digital surveillance. The state has gained power over physical space itself, compressing or stretching it entirely at will. The original goal, simply to relieve the old railways and speed up coal delivery, has long been forgotten beneath layers of concrete. The system has taken its final form, transforming from an economic engine into a highly complex mechanism for maintaining power. The enormous, irreversible national debt became simply an acceptable price to pay for political monolithism and absolute order. The body of the railroad has completely and irrevocably merged with the body of the state itself, becoming its central nervous system. And this vast system no longer tolerates malfunctions, vibrations, or unplanned random stops. Take another look at this dazzling white train, silently gliding over the green rice terraces. It is truly impeccably stable inside. Not even the water in a plastic cup on a folding table trembles in the carriage. The design has achieved absolute sterile perfection, completely erasing from memory the grime and stuffiness of the slow trains of the 90s. But now you know exactly what kind of tension this tranquility is cast from, and what these cyclopean supports stand upon. This incredible speed has been bought at the price of billions in irrecoverable debts, regions squeezed dry, and mistakes buried in the ground. This is not a celebration of freedom of movement, but a triumph of total, mathematically precise control over every meter traveled. The railroad has physically compressed the vast continent to the size of a single, clearly visible room without doors. And as long as this steel mechanism keeps moving, the country will obediently race forward along the tracks laid out for it.